Hey everyone, we just announced our Series A led by Khosla Ventures, and I'm very excited to talk to Gyan from Surface Ventures today, who was actually the very first VC to ever invest in our company, even before raising our seed round. Gyan, thanks for joining me for this quick session.
Thanks for having me.
You're managing partner at Surface Ventures. For those who don't know Surface, would you mind running us, through your fund's elevator pitch?
Sure. So, our most recent fund is $50 million, and we invest in B2B software across categories we know well. That includes things like DevOps, developer tools, data infrastructure, a category we call B2B infrastructure, which is basically companies that sell to other B2B companies, as well as some verticals, including digital health, fintech, and prop tech. We try to go deep in the trenches with founders. We meet with most of them every 2 weeks, although we actually meet every 4 weeks, and try to help them kind of bring some hygiene to building an early stage company. Really, building an early stage company tends to be pretty lonely, and hopefully we can kind of be there with the founders that we work with.
Before we dive a little bit deeper into that, I just want to thank you for, truly being one of the best VCs that, I had the pleasure to meet so far. As a founder, you're always looking for people that kind of have your back, and you're definitely trying to, put a founder's interest in front of your own, to be honest. And I think that's not always aligned in VC and startup world. But you're doing a fantastic job. You're always available, right? You always have great opinions, but you also, obviously let the founder make their own decisions ultimately. And yeah, I just want to, thank you for that before we dive a little deeper.
Yeah, thank you for building the company and doing all the work.
You're probably, you mentioned it, one of the most hands-on VCs out there. I know when you invest in a company, right? Like you start really becoming part of the ecosystem and space that company is operating in. For us, that's obviously the cloud native Kubernetes space. You're super involved. You're in all of the Kubernetes communities. You're on Reddit. You're on X, Twitter. You're on our Slack channel. Sometimes even replying to our community users, answering questions. That's just super impressive that you're going that deep. We're obviously not your only portfolio company. Do you do this with every one of your companies? And, how do you manage to find the time for all of this?
Yeah, I try. Definitely, there are some areas that are easier because I know them a little bit better. In terms of finding time for these, I think the biggest thing is I just don't have that many hobbies other than kind of working and spending time with my significant other and my dog. So that leaves me lots of time for work. And I like what I do. I think it's really fun to kind of build companies and see how companies get built. And Kubernetes is fascinating as well as an area. Like it's getting adopted very quickly amongst even the laggard companies. So it's a fun seat to kind of sit in and watch the evolution of the community and the company.
That makes a ton of sense. You discovered our potential super, super early on, pretty much before, any other VC out there, like all the major funds kind of even have heard of us, I guess. What got you excited when we first met and when you first heard about the idea of virtual Kubernetes clusters?
Yeah, so for me, there haven't been a lot of great successes in Kubernetes to date, but my own personal thesis is that, like every other industry, you go through kind of phases of adoption, and Kubernetes adoption is increasing every year. Datadog has some interesting data about this online. And I think we're finally at the point where kind of the bulk of the market is starting to adopt Kubernetes as a technology. We passed that early adopter phase. And in that bulk phase, um, virtual clusters become very powerful because they reduce costs. In fact, they're probably even easier to manage than regular Kubernetes clusters, which are pretty heavy. That seems to be just a very powerful kind of next layer of virtualization for potentially the entire internet. Kubernetes is becoming a standard, and it's a very heavy, expensive standard that's hard to manage. To me, it just kind of makes sense, to be honest, that people will use something that's cheaper and easier to manage. And if you are the originator of that technology, you should be able to build a great business on top of it.
That makes a ton of sense. We're definitely trying. You're obviously seeing a lot of enterprise tech companies, a lot of B2B focused companies with everyone who's pitching you, but also the companies obviously that you get deeper with, where you're investing. Why do you think vCluster in particular is getting so much traction, especially with the enterprise?
I think it just solves a pain point that they have, which is like both cost and then the complexity of managing hundreds or thousands of clusters. The core of it is that it solves a pain point that a kind of customer base has. Beyond that, it also makes sense for the enterprises to adopt. They kind of want some CYA, and an enterprise commercial open source vendor makes sense in that kind of dynamic. If you think of just like the cost of running an EKS cluster on a monthly basis, it's not cheap. And that assumes that you still have kind of all the resources to manage that cluster, keep updates up to date and things like that, even do updates and deployments of new clusters at like kind of new Kubernetes versions and things like that. So to me, it's just a simpler, easier paradigm for enterprises to adopt. I do think the product has kind of more breadth to it than even enterprise adoption. Like this can one day get adopted by next generation clouds, and as well as like companies that even want to offer like single tenant applications and on their own cloud to multiple different customers in a hybrid kind of multi-tenant way. So I think it is very kind of, it's a powerful paradigm, but there's just an obvious adoption vector in the enterprise to me.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. I remember when we first met, we were a lot more individual developer focused and very, very grassroots and not so much focused on the enterprise. And you actually pointed that out back then, even before you invested, that, going after an enterprise first, which sounded super scary for me at the time, was actually going to be a smarter move for a company like us. So, thanks for that initial piece of advice. I guess I didn't think you were right back then, to be honest, but turned out you were very right.
That's okay. Yeah, it worked out.
You mentioned open source, earlier, and I think, obviously we launched vCluster. A lot of people know our vCluster project even before they hear about the company Loft and, what we're building on top. Last year, we launched DevPod as another open source project that gained a lot of traction super, super quickly. DevPod obviously just like, code spaces alternative, but built in the open source and much more independent of the infrastructure. You can run it in pretty much any cloud environment. With all of this open source technology that we're building, was that very important for you when you invested? Do you have a particular thesis around investing in open source rooted companies?
Yeah, so I think open source is a great way to get developer love, to get adoption for many companies. When it comes to open source businesses, there are probably actually like multiple different considerations you have to put in place before you decide to go that route. So one as an example is if you're an open source database that's very different than many other open source projects. The story there is basically around kind of not having full lock-in, but long term, most customers are just going to use your commercial offering because total cost of ownership is too high otherwise. Another consideration is around who owns the open source community, or basically how that open source community functions. Maybe one of the like earlier canonical examples of an open source set of businesses was like how Hortonworks and Cloudera, and they basically fought over the Hadoop community. I do think that the open source paradigm is actually not one paradigm. It's a set of paradigms. And you probably don't fall into the database paradigm. You fall into a different paradigm. And just thinking through how your business is actually going to acquire customers, get awareness, and then build a defensible product in the context of your open source strategy is super important. The value of open source is that it does give enterprises comfort, to me, that they have an out. It also allows developers to build on your ecosystem, which is super powerful because they don't feel like they're locked into one technology. So you have the chance to become more of a standard. And I think that's extremely powerful for building kind of a platform business.
I think that makes a ton of sense. When we, initially developed virtual clusters as a technology before vCluster as an open source project was born, we just felt like this could be bigger than this commercial solution. And as you said, kind of making it an industry standard. The best route kind of to get there is really with open source these days. But you kind of mentioned it, like with all the benefits of open source and with everything that the community offers and kind of, helps the project become successful. It's also often very, kind of tough to build a sustainable business. Obviously we've seen all the latest headlines around, Terraform, Redis, and lots of other companies like doing these kind of like, relicensing moves that are pretty tricky to kind of understand for a lot of users out there, and that stir up a lot of things in the community. And then we've obviously seen companies like Weaveworks in our space, right, ultimately, unfortunately, go under despite having a lot of open source traction with projects like Flux. Do you see anything that founders can do to set themselves and their company up for success, and making sure that they won't run into these road bumps ultimately?
Yeah, so I think first off, every company has to consider what the best license is for their business. And sometimes relicensing might be the right approach. So I'd advise companies to think through their licensing approach. Beyond that, figuring out what features or functionalities are in the commercial product versus the open source project is very helpful. And having a deliberate approach to how you'll differentiate between the two is pretty important. I think, as an example, maybe for Weaveworks, that might have been a challenge that they faced. Two other things that would come to mind are, I think open source companies kind of live and die by their ability to continue innovating relative to a closed source business, which kind of goes into value extraction mode much earlier. So you have to constantly be thinking about kind of what the next product is and what the next project is that will kind of be innovation at the top of the funnel. Fortunately for you guys, you definitely have DevPod as another project that already has, I don't know, like 6,000 GitHub stars or more at this point, and climbing. So driving continued innovation is just super important if you're going to kind of take this commercial open source approach, to me. I wish there was also like a little bit of a better environment vis-a-vis the clouds or the big cloud companies and open source. I don't have a solution here, but I actually think the challenge for many open source companies isn't really that some small competitor or your average developer develops something cool on top. Even for HashiCorp, I argue their strategic challenge isn't that companies like Spacelift or M0 build something on top of them. It's more that the big cloud vendors kind of co-opt their innovation. And I don't have an answer there, honestly. I wish I did. I would actually love to see some sort of license innovation around this one day, but that's the one place where I'm still quite perplexed, to be honest.
Got it. So the license to say, hey, everybody can build on top of this, but maybe not the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah, I mean, they should sponsor. They have more than enough capital to bring great value to every project instead of just co-opting. And instead of sponsoring maybe the CNCF with millions of dollars, they could sponsor the individual open source projects or something like that. I don't know. I don't have a great answer there, though.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The CNCF does do definitely some sponsoring, but there's still a big gap in terms of what is actually necessary to, sustainably run a company that can really support open source technology at that level where really a lot of like enterprises rely on it. The Kubernetes space in general is a tough one, given that there's such a high concentration of these ultra large companies in the world, like the Google, Microsoft, Amazon, even Red Hat, right? Want to kind of almost dominate every little aspect, and they're obviously fighting against each other in this ecosystem as well. So they're looking out for every innovation to get an edge against their competitors. Why do you think we have the potential to thrive in this highly competitive environment?
So we've already talked a little bit about kind of the breadth that's possible through virtual clusters, just the applications to enterprises, which span managing fleets of clusters, but also include things like building ephemeral developer environments using virtual clusters instead of spinning up an actual cluster. Also kind of taking cluster snapshots and bringing them back up over time, which can save cost. So that breadth is incredibly valuable, I think. The other thing that's very valuable to me is that each of these major vendors is in some ways a walled garden. And when you layer on a virtualization layer that hopefully over time can be kind of independent of those walled gardens, it does create some portability that would be really great for every enterprise to have, because they could then move from a virtual cluster sitting on top of EKS to AKS to GKE to OpenShift as an example, and maybe be abstracted away from some of the intricacies of how each of those major vendors locks people in. So that to me is just a huge, huge boon. I'd also just note that we've already talked a little bit about DevPod. I do think what Loft is building is more than just virtual clusters. So what allows the company to be huge as well, to me, is a bet I'm making on continued innovation cycles beyond even vCluster and DevPod. You guys have already shown the ability to create powerful open source projects beyond those two. For instance, DevSpace, which you guys donated to CNCF and still help maintain, was a nice innovation that's used by a significant more amount of enterprise companies for free. So I'm betting partly on that continued innovation cycle, just continue onwards.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, sometimes I feel like I gotta hold the team back actually to say like, hey, let's not, run immediately to the next hot thing and ship that as open source. That let's polish what we already have. Let's, make sure we actually get to a very, very stable state and improve the user experience and obviously build out the commercial offering in parallel. But there's so many ideas in the company. Sometimes I feel like I have to, slow us down on that innovation front a little bit. So hopefully, as we grow as a company, more funding comes in and more, more people are working at this company. We're actually able to unleash more of that innovation that seems to kind of be, already existing in our heads right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pendulum, or it's a dynamic that's really difficult for multi-product companies, because building an individual product takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and especially for the enterprise, you need to give them a product that is of enterprise quality, resiliency, and with enterprise level customer service, and that takes time. I don't think we can successfully kind of drop a new product every 6 months. We aren't kind of DJs who come out with new kind of singles. We got to go through the right release processes and right beta processes so that our customers are really happy when they get the project and product. But we're learning that, and I think we've learned some of that through vCluster and then some of that through DevPod, where I think you've made some nice adjustments to balance innovation and the kind of commercial needs of your customer base. So I'm really happy about that.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I think in terms of the enterprise, the demand for like reliable software, as you phrased it, right? And that resilience baked in is just very important, because ultimately, they can run with a lot of open source technologies, but what they really care about is that it, doesn't all break down in 6 months from now. And that really comes down to having the right QA process in place, having the right kind of security standards set up, and also on the personal level, doing having the support processes in place for them, the customer success in place, right? Really making sure that the customer doesn't just buy the product, but also rolls it out, becomes successful with it, and it can really rely on it at a certain scale. As like for us, it's definitely beneficial to have a lot of team members in different time zones, and we're fully distributed across the globe. And I think we're probably very early to be able to offer something like 24/7 support, just because there's always somebody working in this company, and that's obviously a big benefit. Even when we were just like 20 people, that was great for a lot of our enterprises that obviously have dev teams in India and like folks in Europe and the United States kind of split, right? So it's great for them to not just have the 9 to 5 Pacific time zone as their kind of support tier from the start, but a little bit much more extended kind of world. In that sense, like building such a distributed team, do you think we're an outlier in your portfolio, or do you see it more and more popular? Especially after pandemic, folks may not even have an office and be fully distributed.
So in 2021 and 2022, so many companies went into kind of a distributed mode. Since then, it's actually felt like the pendulum swung the other way, where many companies are starting to consolidate again in certain centers. For companies in enterprise infrastructure, and in particular in DevOps or Kubernetes space, I think there are other reasons, including things like geographic resiliency and kind of providing 24/7 on-call support, that makes sense to be distributed. Um, Beyond kind of the on-call support side of it, the reality is just like the labor that is strong in the Kubernetes space um, isn't all in the United States. A lot of it is actually in Europe, and that labor in Europe often is actually, I'd argue, less expensive than working with people in the United States. So I think the decision between being distributed and being co-located is a fine balance. I do believe that it's always important to have people see each other in person, no matter what. If you're distributed, you got to find ways to uh, make that happen around conferences, around other events. But it's also a nuanced decision that you have to make around your company, its culture, the space that you're in. And I think for Loft, there's a history of companies, including GitLab, kind of building in your space that are distributed, which makes me a little bit more comfortable with that dynamic.
Yeah, I think definitely open source rooted companies are kind of primed to go down that route just because open source is inherently distributed, right? People from different companies or people in their free time, everything is asynchronous by default. So a lot of folks that join our team kind of live and breathe that culture already, and that makes it much, much easier to build a team around it. But as you mentioned, FaceTime is important, and we definitely want to foster these like personal relationships within the team. So events like KubeCon or Kubernetes Community Days, where we can actually, at least bring parts of the team together, or sometimes, especially the first couple of KubeCons, we brought the entire team together. We tagged another like 4 or 5 days to it, and just had an offsite afterwards. Did some fun things in that, city, wherever it was, like Amsterdam, Valencia, right? Most recently Paris. I think the team really, really enjoys that part, and that is something you kind of have to be much more intentional about than if you are going, for lunch every day anyway. I feel like, that's very clear in my opinion. Awesome. Now that we hit this, next level of funding and stage of the company, what's your advice for me and, for the company as a whole going forward? Obviously, we want to kind of, level up from here. What's your advice to get there?
I think just kind of continue to be disciplined about building your product with your customers in mind and with their feedback, and then be thoughtful about this pendulum between innovation and servicing your customers and giving them a best-in-class product. I'm confident we'll figure out the rest because most of the rest of it is execution, and we have great investors who have come on board to help us with that. We also have more resources to bring on more of the right people, because I think we already have many of the right people and amazing people on the team to achieve everything tactically, but just being strategically thoughtful about balancing innovation and excellence, because that's not an easy balance to get right, especially when you're selling into enterprise.
That makes a ton of sense. We'll try to definitely keep that in mind. Thank you so much. And thanks a lot for joining this session. I'm super excited to continue this partnership. I know we've been working for like 3+ years together at this point, and hopefully there will be many years to come to ride on this journey. Thank you so much for joining me here. I hope the session was helpful for anybody to meet yet another of our very, very early backers. And if you're as fired up as Gyan is about vCluster, head to vCluster.com to check it out. Definitely feel free to join our Slack channel at slack.vcluster.com. There are a lot of great conversations there. There's a lot of things about DevPod there as well. So I hope to see everyone in that community channel. And thanks again for the time, Gyan.
Yeah, and don't forget to check out vCluster Pro. If you want to buy it, please consider it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cheers. See ya.